Thank you for a very nice introduction. And first of all, thank you all for coming and for inviting me. And hello also to everyone watching online. And I feel like before I start talking, I have to also acknowledge that I'm a huge fan of Eurovision. So it was a very nice touch to bring the Estonian representative. I've actually been to Eurovision several times myself, although not going this year. So nice to get a little bit of that here, quite unexpected. I'll start by introducing myself a little bit. So my name is Adam Tyrcha. I'm head of research at Newsec in Sweden. I've been at Newsec for about 5 years. I work primarily with different forms of research questions. I write our free report, which is called the Newsec Property Outlook, which we release twice a year, and also work with a lot of market analyses for our different customers around in the Nordics. And prior to beginning at Newsec, I also wrote a PhD over in Cambridge about the impact of migration on house prices, which is becoming quite relevant again today. Sadly, I suppose. I'm not going to talk, that would be another entire presentation which I could hold, so I'll leave that there, but since then I've been working at Newsec in Sweden. A few words about Newsec. I think quite a lot of my colleagues are here today, and of course we're very happy to speak to all of you. Newsec is part of the Stronghold Group, that's our holding owner company. We also have a sister company called Niam, which is one of the largest property funds in the Nordics. And Newsec ourselves, we are one of the largest, perhaps the largest real estate consulting company in the Nordics and Baltics with over 2,000 employees. We have a big property asset management branch, which is the second largest in Europe, actually, even though we're only active in the Nordics and Baltics. We do a bunch of valuation, we sign a lot of leases, and we do a lot of deals all over the entire region. And the team that I formerly belong to is called Valuation and Strategic Analysis. I don't work too much with valuation myself, but having this setup allows us access to a lot of data, which means I can do presentations like this, which I'm going to do for you today, and share some insights. And as I mentioned, I work with research, but research at Newsec is perhaps a little different to some of our clients in that it's also a sort of branch of business in itself, which we make money on. So I also do a lot of different forms of market analyses, custom, tailor-made for both property owners and the government in different forms, municipalities, government branches, and so on. Working across the entire Nordics. I think that's all I have to say about Newsec. So getting into what I'm actually here to talk to you about, which is of course a form of market update on the Nordic real estate market, and particularly looking at both the opportunities and challenges which are facing the market, perhaps focusing a little more on the opportunities. I like to be positive, but I'll also try to be objective, so we have to talk about the downside risks as well. I'll start by setting the stage a little bit. I'm not going to talk too much about the macroeconomy. I know we have some panel discussions about that coming up later today, but of course it's extremely relevant for the real estate industry, and it's difficult to talk about the outlook for real estate without touching on that at least a little bit. Of course, the Ukraine invasion is what's sort of on everyone's minds. The direct impacts of that on real estate in the Nordics, we find are quite limited so far. March was perhaps a little bit calmer than usual, but from month to month it can vary quite a bit on the transaction market. In general, it's been a very strong Q1, which I'll get into a little bit later as well. But of course, the indirect impacts of the invasion could be quite substantial, with the potential of, or the actual, what's already happening with very strong rising inflation and of course the potential for rising interest rates. That looks a bit different across the different Nordics. As our previous speaker mentioned, Norway has already raised the interest rate several times. The ECB, and in effect also Denmark, which has to follow the ECB because of the currency peg, and the Swedish central bank have been a little more hesitant. Everyone now seems to be forecasting a lot of rises in the interest rate this year, even though everyone except the Swedish central bank themselves, perhaps. But we think it's realistic to believe that there will be some rises in the interest rate. And of course, that does impact real estate. We do still think, looking at how both the ECB and the Swedish central bank have acted in the past 15 years, I'm perhaps a little softer than some forecasters. I find it hard to believe that they'll be as aggressive as some people think. I read some forecasts of 8 increases in the interest rate in the next 2 years and so on in Sweden, which I find difficult to believe given how they've acted in the past 15 years, being quite passive. There were quite many good opportunities to raise the interest rate during the 2010s, and they chose not to. Of course, they then referred to lower inflation. Now we have high inflation, but we also have falling growth, and likely we have stagflation with rising unemployment and rising inflation at the same time. But definitely they will raise the interest rate probably this year. When I started working on this presentation before the invasion, and then the impacts of technology seemed a little more relevant than now. Now everything seems a little bit dwarfed by the invasion, I would say. But of course, we are seeing a lot of trends in terms of digitalization of real estate, making your properties more digital and connected to one another, and that also does have long-term impacts on the property market. Some of the big trends which I'm going to touch on, I'm going to go through each property segment in brief, but these are some of the wider trends impacting the real estate market. The office survival, I think, is a very clear and interesting trend, particularly here in the Nordics and Baltics, actually. When you look at occupancy rates for the office, we're at about, depending on the country and city, at about 70 to 80% of pre-COVID occupancy rates in the Nordics and Baltics, which is actually incredibly strong compared to essentially everywhere else globally. In a lot of European countries, they're at 50 to 60%. In some US cities, they're much lower than that. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that actually we have returned to the office to a large degree in our region. And it's easy to get kind of carried away when reading these international reports coming out from the US or the UK or elsewhere in Europe. And they're not necessarily as relevant to our region. And I think the reason that we have this strong occupancy is, partly in some of our countries we had fairly lax lockdowns. Of course not here, but Sweden is an example of that. But also we have quite a good work-life balance and good working culture here in the Nordics and Baltics, and working from home was not completely unheard of before the pandemic. We have a bit more flexibility than some other countries. I've lived and worked in the UK as well, so I feel like I can say that. And so it's not as, we don't have the culture of FaceTime and so on in the same way. And I think that has led to, we already had some working from home before the pandemic, so the impact is not as large in that sense. Other trends, retail and e-commerce. E-commerce, of course, huge growth in 2020, a little weaker growth now, sort of back on the pre-pandemic growth path. But of course, that has impacted physical retail. We actually, in our latest Newsec Property Outlook, which I'll share some of the results from that here later, touched quite a lot on retail. Physical retail, I think, unfairly punished in the Nordics for a lot of reasons. I'll get into that later. Sustainable financing has already been touched on a little bit. I feel others will touch on that better than I will, but of course that's a big trend in our region as well. A lot of big M&A transactions, but also records in terms of the number of transactions in our region. So a lot of activity in general. essentially loads of records in 2021, and it'll be interesting to see how 2022 will go from that perspective, whether the yield compression will continue or whether interest rates will rise substantially, that will taper off a little bit. Of course, a strong appetite for logistics as well. I feel like no one has missed that. So I'll start just by summarizing 2021 a little. This is 2021 on the transaction market in Europe. And I don't want to be too Sweden-centric here, but I feel like it's important and fun to acknowledge that this is the first time ever that Sweden had a stronger transaction volume than France on the transaction market. France, of course, has a population 6.5 times larger than Sweden, and yet still Sweden in absolute terms even has a larger transaction volume. Of course, a huge transaction volume record for Sweden last year, which drove that. Norway and Denmark also transaction volume records last year, very strong activity. Finland did not have a record, but had a stronger year than most previous years, and sort of a return to growth on the transaction volume market. And the Baltics also had a record last year on the transaction market. So if you put all of our countries together, we're actually stronger than Germany. So you can say that we're the largest transaction market in Europe. It's cheating a little bit, but that's okay. And yeah, this is just the breakdown by country shown in a different way, but a very interesting year last year because as you can see, the past 6 years before that, we actually had a very stable transaction volume between 40 and 50 billion euros, essentially, and actually ending up at almost 77 billion euros last year. And this is the transaction volume by segment. The segment split is quite interesting to talk about in the Nordic context because residential is the largest segment in the Nordics, but it doesn't exist in half the countries, or it's very small. In the Baltics, it's quite a small segment, PRS, and in Norway, it's also a very small segment. But in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, it's the largest segment, 30% of the volume in Sweden and 50% of the volume in Denmark and Finland, which makes it the largest segment overall. Office segment came in second. Looks like a bit of a return to normalcy for the office, but we had a lot of big M&A transactions in the office segment all over the Nordic region last year. If you remove those, there's not that many deals, but the deals that were completed at very strong levels. And the third segment, we have logistics, or industrial, as I've called it here. I guess no one has missed the growth of industrial all over the European region. And then in fourth, we actually have another segment which doesn't really exist in a lot of the countries, which is public properties, sometimes referred to as community service properties, which is effectively any buildings where the government is a tenant. So hospitals, schools, elderly care, also office buildings with a government tenant we would class as public properties. And I'll go into all of this in a moment. Just a brief recap of each country as well. As I mentioned already, a record high transaction volume in Sweden, partly driven by the big M&A transactions. You may have read about Castellum's acquisition of Kungsleden or Corum's acquisition of Klaven. But actually, if you remove all the M&A deals, it's still a record volume. So it's definitely not only those that have driven the volume. And the yellow line here is the number of transactions, which is on the right axis here. And as you can see, 800 transactions on the Swedish transaction market last year, which is also a record. So really widespread interest for real estate and for all different segments, essentially. Quite a low share of foreign investors in Sweden at 17%. It's been between 25 and 30% in the past few years. That's essentially because foreign investors weren't involved in any of the major M&A transactions, apart from one. But if you look at the volume purchased by foreign investors, it's actually stronger than previous years. So interest definitely remains. Finland was the Nordic market that didn't have a record year last year, but a stronger volume than 2020 and 2019. The Finnish market is quite different to Sweden. It's driven a lot more by foreign investors, about half of which are Swedish investors. Sweden's quite unique in that we have 50 real estate companies listed on the stock market. In Germany, there's 38. So we, in some sense, have too many, you could say, and a lot of strong domestic capital. Whereas in Finland and Denmark, there's a lot fewer domestic companies and a lot more interest from other Nordic and also international investors, driven a little bit by the euro as well. But that does make the market a little more volatile in terms of the stability of the transaction volumes, but a strong volume last year anyway for the market. Denmark is another of those countries that did have a record year last year, ending up at just over 13 billion euros in transaction volume. I didn't write the foreign presence here, but it's about 50% there as well, and also about half of them are Swedish investors. There's quite interesting parallels between the Danish and Finnish transaction markets, even though the countries are very different in terms of geography and perhaps don't have the strongest links in the Nordics. But the markets are relatively similar, with a dominance of residential and a lot of interest from Swedish investors in particular. And Norway had a transaction volume record just over 16 billion euros. Return of foreign investors, there's always quite a low share of foreign investors in the Norwegian market because of high hedging costs and also a relatively strong domestic market. But ending up at 18% foreign investment last year. Actually, the first time ever that the percentage share of foreign investors in Norway was larger than Sweden, but it's only by 1 percentage point, so it's not a huge trend, but still something quite interesting to acknowledge. And a lot of big transactions, quite a few big office transactions in Norway last year. And lastly, the Baltics. Also a very strong year for the market, ending up at roughly 1.5 billion euros in transaction volume. Of course, there's a lot less transactions here, so this can fluctuate a little bit, and particularly between the countries, but also a very strong year for the market, with quite a healthy share of foreign investments, so a lot of interest in the market coming from both the other Nordic countries and also outside the Nordics. And this is just the breakdown by the different Baltic countries. I believe most, but not all, had a record year last year. Estonia didn't quite break its record, but I think Latvia did, and Lithuania was close. But yeah, essentially strong interest all over the market. Okay, I'm going to go into each property segment in brief and just highlight some of the trends and opportunities and maybe challenges that face the markets. So if we start with offices, quite interestingly, actually a record volume for office last year, but as I mentioned, there were those big M&A deals which drove that to some degree. If you remove those, as I mentioned, quite few transactions, but the ones that did occur completed at strong levels. Increasing volumes for the office market overall compared to 2020. Actually, more volume in 2021 in every market, which is quite interesting to note. If you look at yields, we're down at around 3% for the best office properties in the Nordics. Of course, we've seen some deals below 3% even. Becomes a bit of a question of what you call prime yield, but it's possible you could even say the prime yield is even below 3%. It's a little difficult to cover each country here, but strong compression actually in 2021 for all office markets, you could say. And 2022 is really a question of what you think about the interest rates. Our personal belief is that there won't be time for enough hikes to make the yield compression actually taper off completely. So we believe there's probably room for a little bit more compression before all those rate hikes come in. But of course, the likelihood of interest rate increases has increased a lot, even in the time since I actually made this presentation, or roughly 2 weeks ago. So you know, it's a bit a question of what you believe. Generally, if you're considering selling, now could be a good time in that sense, because it is possible that yields will taper off or begin to rise in the next few years. So quite an exciting time for real estate in that sense. I don't want to talk too much about this because I feel like everyone has already talked about the transformation of office space, the increased polarization. We need more meeting spaces and all that. Of course, that still holds. Generally, we think, as I mentioned, we have strong return to occupancy of the office in the Nordic region at 70 to 80%. But that still means 20 to 30% less people are at the office. Of course, what's important to look at is really the peak occupancy rate. If you have some days when everyone is actually in at the office at the same level as pre-pandemic, then perhaps you need the same amount of office space as before, but perhaps you need to use it in different ways. But generally, I think it would be wrong to not acknowledge that some office submarkets are going to struggle. Not the prime submarkets, probably not the prime suburban submarkets either, but the submarkets a little further out where employees don't feel that enough value is added by them being at the office, perhaps a little more difficult to get to, and so on. But of course, that will vary from submarket to submarket and country to country. And just a few examples of strong transactions, which we saw last year, as I mentioned earlier. Strong new record levels. I believe the transaction in the middle is the lowest office yield that we've seen in the Nordics, at well below 3%, and it's in Gothenburg, not Stockholm. Of course, you could say it's a special transaction in some sense, but it still does show the very strong interest in the market. And we saw a lot of interesting transactions similar to that in the other countries, in Denmark and Latvia shown here, but generally a lot of activity in the segment as a whole. Retail, I think, is a super interesting segment, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think has been a little bit unfairly punished in the Nordics. But I'll get into that. Start just by talking about the transaction volume here too. Relatively strong year for retail in 2021, ending up at 7.7 billion. Of course, it was a record year on the market as a whole, and it's not a record year for retail. But there is a lot of interest for some parts of the segment, particularly the big box external retail, grocery stores. We've seen a lot of transactions within. We haven't seen that many transactions in shopping centers. And perhaps unfairly, and I'm going to explain why, but just starting by sort of acknowledging how e-commerce looks. In 2020, huge growth online retail growth, growth rates of up to 50%, but these statistics lag a little bit, but in 2021 we're back to around 10%, which is the growth rate we had before the pandemic. And here I have a Sweden graph showing the total volume of e-commerce sales in Sweden as a whole. And you can pretty clearly see that from 2019 to 2020 you have that jump, but then from 2020 to 2021 we're back on sort of the pre-pandemic levels of growth. So really, the COVID has accelerated e-commerce growth, but perhaps it hasn't changed the market as much as we might think. Rather, we're back on the pre-pandemic levels of growth. Of course, retail was already struggling before the pandemic because of e-commerce, and COVID just served to accelerate that trend a little bit. In terms of yield compression, I didn't put all the countries here. Just a bit of a summary, but sort of as I mentioned, big boxes where we've seen interest. The rest we've seen yields increase. And I'll skip this one and go over to this slide, which is on from our recent Newsec Property Outlook, which I thought was super interesting. So we actually looked at the turnover for different forms of retail in the Nordics in 2021 compared to 2019, and in 2020 compared to 2019. And regional center for us is the sort of big experience-based shopping centers, like T1 here, or Mall of Scandinavia in Sweden. City Mall is the inner city retail. I don't know Tallinn well enough, unfortunately, but the kind of malls, NK in Sweden, the malls you have in the middle of the city. District center, I can start with neighborhood center actually, which is the local form of shopping center, which in a primarily residential area, which is primarily used by the people that live there. And then district center is something in between regional center and neighborhood center. So sort of a semi-regional center where maybe some people from the nearby region will travel there, but it's also a local center. And what I think is really interesting here is the orange dots, which show the turnover 2021 compared to 2019. And they actually show that regional centers and neighborhood centers and retail parks have stronger turnover in 2021 compared to 2019, which I think retail parks, people have understood that, but the other two, not necessarily been the picture that we've seen being painted in the media with the death of the shopping center and so on, particularly the regional sort of experience-based shopping center. And also district centers at around 0, doing quite well there. City malls, of course, still struggling. I think it'll be difficult for city malls to return to pre-pandemic levels given the office occupancy rates. We will be working from home a little bit more than before. But I think this is a picture that a lot of investors haven't really understood, and I think retail being a little unfairly broad-brushed by international investors in particular. In the Nordics and Baltics, we have a lot of grocery-anchored retail. We have a lot of community service property elements in our retail, which is not the case at all in a lot of shopping centers in the UK, for instance, which are a lot more fashion-oriented. And so in that sense, I think it's important to understand how retail works in a country, and therefore I do actually see a lot of potential in shopping centers in our region. And yeah, I think everyone has also heard and understood that we need more experiences and so on to get people into our shopping centers. I won't touch too much on that. I think this sustainability aspect will be covered more in the later panels as well. But I think that's a dimension that's starting to be talked about a little bit more now, but I think needs to be discussed more, because we really have two trends in the Nordics and Baltics which don't really go together, which is a huge focus on ESG and sustainability, but at the same time a huge growth in e-commerce and an expectation of next-day delivery, an expectation that you can send back your goods for free, ideally. So a lot of packages being sent back and forth. And we had flight shame in the Nordics before. I don't think e-commerce shame is a good enough term, so hopefully someone comes up with something better. But I think that's something that could start to be discussed more going forward for the retail segment, and particularly create both challenges and opportunities for e-commerce and physical retail, and perhaps a way to think about more synergies between the two segments. A few transactions, so these are the ones we've seen go at lower and lower yields with the big box properties or the grocery store properties. A few examples from different countries being shown here, some going at very strong prices per square meter as well. Kävlinge is south of Sweden, I should mention. And then shopping centers, we've seen a little less interest, but we have seen a few strong transactions here in Estonia. The one in the middle is in Sweden, end of the year, really the only big sort of partly experience-based shopping center, although I'd probably call it more of a district center, that was sold last year in Sweden at quite a strong level. But quite few examples of these transactions, and as I mentioned, I do think there's more potential to these properties than some investors have realized. Logistics or logistics warehouse industrial. Of course, I think no one has missed the huge growth in the transaction volume and interest and massive yield compression within this segment. I think this graph is quite interesting. So the yellow line here is the percentage of the industrial and logistics volume which on the transaction volume market, which in the Nordics, which international investors have accounted for. And the blue or black line is the percentage of the total transaction volume which international investors account for. And COVID really shows a very clear shift where pre-pandemic industrial and logistics was actually less popular among international investors than the average segment in the Nordics. They were a lot more keen on office and retail. While post-pandemic, this has really become the new core segment in a sense for a lot of international investors. which of course we all know, but the numbers also back that up. This is from our last Newsec Property Outlook, which we released in the autumn, where we had a logistics theme. And there's a bit of explaining to do here, but so on the left-hand axis, we have the total stock in thousands of square meters, which are these bars. And on the right-hand axis, we have these dots, which are the total stock per capita. These numbers don't really mean much on their own, but if you compare them to each other, I think it's quite interesting. So really focusing on the orange dots here. What they show, of course, is that the total stock per capita for Germany, UK, France, and Netherlands, these dots, is higher than for Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which is not that surprising. Those are continental European logistics markets which serve other countries to a larger degree. But what I think is quite interesting is to note Czech Republic here, or Czechia, I guess you're supposed to call it these days, is quite close to Sweden and Norway in terms of stock per capita. Of course, Czechia serves the other European markets to some degree, but it's still a market that essentially didn't exist 30 years ago. And more interesting to note, Sweden below Norway, which doesn't really make sense. And Denmark here, in particular, I find very strange that there's quite a low logistics stock in Denmark, and also the other countries here. Denmark, in my opinion, or I think quite objectively, has the best logistics location in terms of serving other countries. The Fehmarn Belt Tunnel is being built to Germany and so on. So I think there's quite a lot of opportunities in terms of logistics in Denmark. Yields are still a little bit higher than Norway and Sweden, although they've come down a bit, which doesn't really make sense. So I think there's potential for more modern logistics space in Denmark in particular, but also in Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and to some degree Sweden and Norway as well. This is sort of the breakdown within the industrial segment with industrial, logistics, and warehouse. Or it's light industrial really is what industrial should be labeled as here. And this segment is quite interesting because it's, I think, the only segment where there's such a clear divide between what international investors want and what domestic investors want. International investors, foreign non-Nordic investors here in the middle, essentially, there we go, essentially only want logistics properties, whereas the domestic and Nordic investors are also a lot, they want these too, but they're also interested in light industrial and warehouse. This is in 2021. I think this is starting to change a little bit, and you have to be a bit skeptical as well with the sort of branding perspective here, where I think a lot of foreign investors will call whatever they buy logistics, even if it really isn't. But anyway, that's the trend that we're seeing. Yeah, strong yield compression, as I've mentioned. I think I don't need to say too much more about this. We're down at sort of 3.5%, 3.25, I think, are the lowest transactions we've seen in the Nordics. Approaching office yield rates, really. And but in some continental European markets, yields are even lower for logistics. And in some continental European markets, yields for logistics are lower than for office. So it's not, there's not some like holy, it's not impossible that yields for logistics will be lower for office at some point in our region as well. Although I do think you have to be a little more critical in terms of location in the Nordics, given how much land some of our countries actually have and so on, compared to some continental European markets. So a complete catch-up in terms of yields, I think, would be quite surprising. And yeah, these are basically modern logistics premises are what's been most popular and what particularly international investors, which all of these buyers here are, have been looking for in our region. And of course, we had the big AXA transaction as well, which was a pan-Nordic deal in all 4 of the Nordic countries at a record low yield level as a further example of that. I've left sort of the residential segment and public properties. I'll just touch on those briefly because they're not actually a segment in all of our countries. but at the same time, residential actually the biggest segment in 2021, as I mentioned. Yield levels for residential have continued to fall. We saw quite strong compression on the market here in 2021, and huge transaction volumes, as mentioned. Oslo here, it's not a big market, as I mentioned. That's why the line is a little, or fluctuates a little more than the other countries. And these are new production yields, I should mention, for all these countries. For Sweden in particular, the old stock has much lower yields because of the rent regime which we run. It's difficult to go in depth into this in such a short amount of time. We have very different residential systems in all of our countries, but strong interest for resi in all of them. And a few transactions that happened in some of the countries. As I mentioned, it's not a big segment yet here in the Baltics, but we are seeing some rise in the PRS segment. I think it's a segment which will come more. We're seeing it grow a lot in the UK, where it historically hasn't been a big segment either. And it's quite interesting. We're in quite a unique position in the Nordics in terms of this being a segment in its infancy in some core markets, which they're looking more at now. And we already have this hugely established segment in the Nordics, and as a result, starting to see more and more non-Nordic interest for this segment. And I expect it will grow in the Baltics and Norway as well over time. And of course, the Achilles deal was a big deal in Sweden and Denmark last year as well within this segment at extremely low yields. And briefly on public properties or community service properties, as I mentioned, also not really a segment in a lot of the countries yet. This will probably come, so in my opinion, it's good to sort of keep on top of this and see if there are any opportunities. Even if there's legislation preventing the sale of a lot of public properties in many countries at the moment, really some form of that legislation like that, I think in all the countries except for Sweden and Finland. This could very well be something that rises in the other countries. It's hugely attractive in Sweden and Finland. Of course, you have the government as a tenant on a long lease. It's difficult to think of a safer tenant. And really, I think it's important to sort of see what the political landscape is in your countries and consider that. The government, in essence, has two options. They can raise taxes or they can sell off real estate, publicly owned real estate. Neither are politically popular, but this one is probably less politically unpopular. So as a result, it could very well be a segment which does rise in Denmark, Norway, and the Baltics as well over time. And I think it's an interesting one to keep track of in that sense. Strong yield compression here. We're at sort of 3% or slightly below for the best stuff in Sweden and Finland, which is the second most mature market for this, quite closely behind. Elderly care is generally what attracts the lowest yields, but we're seeing strong compression for all forms. As I mentioned, you have super long leases, and I think what's even more important is the propensity to renew those leases, which can be difficult to know yourself, but we're lucky in that we have quite a lot of data on that. And this is really the segment where there's the highest propensity for lease renewal. And as a result, I think a lot of opportunities in this segment going forward as well. And a few examples of transactions. There was a big preschool portfolio sold in Norway last year. The one in the middle, I believe, a public office, and the one on the right, a police house. In general, strong interest for this segment and the different forms of sub-segments within this segment in Sweden and Finland, and something that will probably rise in the other countries too. You'll notice I didn't touch on hotels in this presentation. I know the next speaker is going to do that, so I thought I'll leave that to him. And yeah, that's all I really had to say today for you, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Do we have questions to Adam? You mentioned, yes, there is a question from Mr. Gusvek. Yeah, we can hand the microphone over there. Please.
Thank you for the presentation. Just wanted to ask, I hear a bit of caution in what you say and also between the lines. Now, we have at the same time seen major price inflation in material prices, energy prices. So if the new build is becoming more expensive, wouldn't that have a positive effect on the price of the existing stock?
I think it could do. It depends a lot on what segment we're talking about and what country. But definitely, I think, I didn't talk too much about residential here, but there could be a huge impact of that on residential, of course, with the rising building costs. In Sweden in particular, we see a lot of reasons for, there was something called the investment grant for residential housing, which has been removed as well. So there's a lot of reason to see that new production might fall, both in residential and for other segments. Also depends on what form of indexation you have in the existing stock, though. I think that's actually going to be a challenge for residential in some of our countries, where I think it will be difficult for rents to rise as much as inflation this year, in Sweden in particular. But I think for some of the other segments, yeah, it's for sure possible. But I think it's difficult to speak in general terms for the entire market. But yeah, it's an interesting point.
Thank you. Adam, do you see that there is a chance or a danger that if capital is looking more yield, and you mentioned it's more compressed, and they're going lower and lower, and then you have the inflation and so on, is there a danger that money is moving out of real estate into different sectors that, okay, we don't see there too much yields, maybe we should allocate the capital somewhere else? Do you see it, or it's those who believe in real estate, historically, it's just a bump on the road. We kind of, we live through the pain and we get on with it.
Yeah,
what do you see?
That's a big question to answer. But, I mean, on the one hand, we have the sort of Tina argument. There is no alternative to real estate. So I definitely think interest for real estate will persist. But it's an interesting argument. I mean, we see government bonds, US government bonds, the returns are over 2% now. For some segments, the yields are not that much higher than that. So there's an interesting balance there. But in general, you also have different allocation strategies for different players and so forth. So I wouldn't say I'm too worried about real estate at this moment. But of course, it's a more relevant dimension now than it has been for many, many years. So it could definitely be relevant in some sense.
Okay. We're going to leave with that note, a little bit tension rising, so and so. But Adam, we really appreciate for you taking the time. Will you be also staying around here for a little bit more?
I'll be here, of course, so feel free to come and talk to me during lunch or whenever. And a lot of my colleagues are here too, and we're happy to talk about the outlook for the market, all of us.
Okay. Well, thank you for the Newsec team, and of course, thank you, Adam Tyrcha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks.